It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'm Bryce Rosenblum, the Artistic Director of World Music Institute, and I'm thrilled to introduce our two guests this evening. As Gabby mentioned, we will send you a recording. We will also send you links to some wonderful recipes that come from the cultural and traditions that Joseph and Brenton are going to share with us. A Low County shrimp and grits dish, and a jollof rice Sierra Leone recipe. Well, I'd love to introduce you to our guests. Professor and anthropologist Joseph Opala is best known for linking one particular Gullah Geechee family from coastal Georgia to its distinct relatives in Sierra Leone. Based on a song in the Mende language they have preserved for almost 250 years. The family came on a state visit to Sierra Leone in 1997, where they visited the village, where their song is still sung today. And there's a wonderful documentary called The Language You Cry In, which chronicles this deeply moving story. Originally from the Briar Patch community in Ulonia, Georgia, Brenton Jordan, grew up in a close Gullah Geechee community. There, Jordan learned the specific nuances of the authentic ring shout. As he grew older, he started performing with the McIntosh County Shouters as a basser and clapper, providing the percussion and helping to maintain the rhythm. Today, he is the stick man for the group, still providing percussion by beating a large wooden stick against a wooden board, as well as leading songs. He is also a storyteller, teaching people about the heritage. He travels around the United States, sharing the Gullah Geechee culture with audiences young and old. He has performed in venues as large as the National Museum of African American History and Culture, to the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and venues as intimate as nursing homes and schools. And we hope to present Brenton and the McIntosh County Shouters in a future season of World Music Institute here in New York. Brenton is also a descendant of London and Amy Jenkins, who are two former Georgia slaves, and the Gullah Geechee culture is something very near and dear to his heart. Being able to share this distinctive culture with the world is one of Jordan's most important objectives, as today's world sees the culture disappearing due to gentrification along the East Coast. Well, let's let the conversation begin. Please join me in welcoming musician and storyteller Brenton Jordan in conversation with historian and anthropologist Joseph Opala. Thank you.
So shall we kick it off ourselves?
Or? I guess so.
I think we know a bit about each other already, but I think you should probably begin with talking about the shouts. It's something most people never heard of, and yet it's maybe the oldest and most profound African custom or cultural or ritual element retained by any African American community in the whole country. Something that needs to be known much better.
Yes, the ring shout at one point was once practiced throughout all of what we now know of as the Gullah Geechee Nation that runs from Jacksonville, North Carolina, all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida. The ring shout is the oldest African American song and dance tradition still surviving in the U.S. since slavery. The people tend to ask, when they ask me what is the ring shout, giving an academic description of the ring shout is an impressive fusion of call and response, singing, percussion, rhythmic percussion, and that's pretty much it. Rhythmic percussion and dance-like movement. As I said before, those who are shouters, we do not truly say that we're dancing due to religious rules against dancing that prevent the shouters from raising their feet high off the floor or crossing one foot over the other. So they move in the shuffling fashion characteristic of a holy dance. That would be the academic description of that. But for a non-academic description, it is a tradition that brings family, community, and spirit together in into one space. The ring shout, like any other African tradition, is not a tradition that is meant to be a spectate. Even though we, as the shouters, when the shouters was created, people tend to just watch us as a performance. But overall, the shout in its traditional standpoint is not to be a spectate. It's not something to just be sat back and watched. It's something that everyone participates in. So if you're not singing, you're clapping. If you're not clapping, you're shouting. If you're not shouting, you're singing or clapping. Or if you're lucky and you happen to have, you're talented enough, you do all of the above. But that's pretty much what the ring shout is. It is a tradition that has been brought from Africa by the various African tribal groups that were brought during the transatlantic slave trade, that had to be developed into something uniquely different. When the shouters first started performing, they created a script for their performances. They would say that the ring shout came from West Africa. But throughout the years, over the 40 plus years of the shouters performing, Africans from all over Africa have constantly told us we needed to change that. That was something that needed to be changed because they do something like that back home, whether it be in South Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, North Africa, they all would say the same thing. So it's clear for us that the movement, the rhythm, and the sound of the shout is something that's uniquely African, that comes from multiple different African tribal groups. So,
but isn't the shout part as well of a larger group of rituals, beginning with the stickman, which is a rite of passage
yes,
ceremony from
yes.
girlhood, womanhood, and boyhood to manhood.
Well, when it comes to the ring shout is more so of a religious thing as opposed to it being necessarily a rite of passage. When it comes to a person back in the day, I would say the last person that I remember or that I've heard stories of having to go seeking would be my grandmother's generation. They would have, before a person was able to join the church, they would have them walk around the wooded area around the church until they had a vision. Over the years, that changed to right around my mother's generation was the time when that whole going around the church thing completely changed. And it just went to praying and reading verses in the Bible until you had a dream. And even in my own generation, we still had to read, when it came to us wanting to be baptized, we had to read scriptures in the Bible until we had a dream. And the mother of the church, you would tell her your dream, and she would then interpret your dream. And based on that dream interpretation would determine whether or not you were quote unquote righteous to join the church and to be baptized. So that's where that came into play, or the seeking came into play. With the ring shout, however, due to it's an interesting thing because the ring shout was not something that was a part of church service.
Mm-hmm.
They would typically have church service first, and then after church services were done, the benches were then moved back, and everybody then would begin to shout. So shouting was always something that was done separate from church service, as opposed to being a part of.
Did they have a prayer house or praise house in your area at that period?
The praise, in fact, the praise house that's in our community is still standing.
Yes.
It was
Seen it.
actually, yes, it was actually built by my great, I think it would be my great grandfather, Joseph Palmer, and it's still standing in our community to this day.
And it looks that old. It's
It
really
it's
phenomenal.
on the outside. I'll say on the outside it looks that old. On the inside it looks untouched by time.
Oh my goodness.
The first time that
Yes.
it was closed for years, and I think the first time they opened it was in 2000. I want to say it was in 2000 because from what I remember, my grandmother telling me they closed it and they hadn't been in it in years before 2000, and they opened it, and she was shocked to see that it looked the same exact way that she remembered when she was a little girl.
Now, traditionally, did they perform the ring shout in the praise house in that
Uh,
particular one or anyone?
Traditionally, the shout was actually done during Christmas, during the Christmas holiday.
Absolutely.
It would start on Christmas Day, and they would go from house to house in the community. Or they would start the week of Christmas, leading up to Christmas, and go from house to house in the community. And then on Christmas Day, they would go to church, have church service, and shout there at the church. And then go back out into the community and shout throughout the community until New Year's Eve. And then on New Year's Eve, they go to church, have church service again. And then from 12 o'clock midnight until daybreak, New Year's Day, they would shout all night long. I always say I came up during the wrong time
Yeah.
because I came up during the wrong time period because during my youth, the max that we would stay up would be maybe 4:30, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, maybe. And then the older I got, the less time that we would spend. So now it's to a point where we might go and we might shout maybe an hour, maybe two.
Is there ever a situation where, after a long period of participating in the ring shout, that people, in a sense, lose themselves and become just almost like a
Not
spirit possessing?
not in not in recent years, I would say. The shout, there are moments when you are doing the shout that you do lose yourself. I would not say that there's a moment of pure spirit possession that happens, but I will say that there are moments where we do lose ourselves. So, like, there are times where I may sing a song or I'm beating the stick and I'll get carried away because for me, it sounds so good. And the performance and the energy in the room is reaching that pitch. And it's literally to a point to where somebody will literally look at me and say, "Are you gonna stop?" Or we're singing a song or something like that, and someone will look and like, "Okay, we're tired." We often there's an inside joke among the shouters when our current songster Freddie Palmer, we always laugh and say, "Oh God, Freddie's about to sing, so we got to make sure and tap Freddie because when Freddie sings, he shut his eyes." And with Freddie's the type of person that he'll get carried away in a song, and his eyes are locked, like his eyes are shut so tight. He doesn't stop to pay attention to the shouters who are out of breath by the end of the song.
My goodness.
Who are out of breath by the end of the song, and all we can do is just sit there and kind of look and be like, "Well, we knew."
I've seen situations in West Africa where a person in a masquerade
Mhm,
believed to be possessed by the spirit that,
mhm,
that masquerade. And in order to control him, because he can get out of control, even and sort of run at the spectators, they have a medicine man following behind him with a calabash or a gourd container with some liquid medicine in it and a whisk, and he'll take it and just sort of flick it on the, they say, devil, and the devil will stop and be confused a moment and look around as if he's wondering where he's at, and then he's slow for a while, and sort of and then he gradually picks up the energy until they have to whisk him again with a little bit of the medicine. And people find it fun because when he charges at the crowd, everybody, especially the kids, scream and run away. And then you can see them looking at gauging, is he going to be out of control again? How long do we have? How close can we get and still be safe? So it's partly real possession, and it's also partly fun.
Yeah,
it can be controlled.
I can definitely say that with the shout. I'll say with Gullah Geechee culture. Gullah Geechee culture, we are Gullah Geechee people as of, I'll say as of maybe 2000. Yeah, I'll say around about 2000 is when a lot of the superstition kind of started to dwindle. But the Gullah Geechee people are renowned, are widely known for our superstitions. So we have, our various different superstitions among ourselves. So like the hag or the jack-o'-lantern or what else? What else? My grandmother used to tell me about when like there was these moments that they would call hot spots. And a hot spot was quote unquote believed to be a space where a spirit may have been sitting or just standing in that spot. And if you were walking, the temperature would just automatically just change in one particular spot. And if they walked past or walked into a hot spot, they would take off running. So those things, we don't have a lot of those anymore. Or a major one is the Passover. And it's not like the Jewish Passover. I have to reiterate, it's not like the Jewish Passover. The Gullah Geechee Passover is when a person has passed within a family. They would take a child who is, I believe, below the age of 5. They would take children below the age of 5 and pass them over the casket of the deceased relative as a way of making, and it's like they would literally do a formal introduction, and they would pass the child over 3 times. And then on the 3rd time, they would turn the child and face the child towards the deceased and do this formal introduction between the deceased and this child, letting them know, do not, take this child, and that this child belongs here with the family. I distinctly remember my Passover. It's something that you never forget if it happens to you. It is definitely one of those situations you never forget if it happens to you. So
you were passed over the coffin.
Yes, I was.
No, I wouldn't forget that.
It was 19. In fact, I remember it was either 1989 or 1990. It was my cousin Dennis's wife, his deceased wife, Angela, and she passed away in a car crash. And they literally, I remember distinctly being passed over her because Dennis is my cousin Chris, who has also passed away just recently. And Dennis was Chris's godfather, and we spent a lot of time with Angela and Dennis. And so she developed this really close relationship with me and my cousin. So we had to be passed over her casket so that she would not take us. So it's definitely one of those things that certain Gullah Geechee traditions, you never forget them if you experience them. I think I might be the only person that remembers their Passover because I don't think I never really asked my cousin, but I don't think that he remembers.
That would be hard to forget, I have to say.
Yeah,
You know,
that's definitely something that's hard to forget.
there's a custom in Sierra Leone, probably other nearby countries as well. When a child is born, they don't remove it from the house for several days, and then they have a ceremony called pulnado, which means removed through the door. And at that point, then they don't know if the life will attach to the child, and they don't bring it from the birthplace into the community until they're sure that it will live. And at that point, when it's outside the house, all the elders come, members of that family, and they address the ancestors. When they do it, some of the elders actually will take the modern currency and wad it up or fold it up into a little thing and then put it into the child's tiny hand. And I was always surprised that the child would grip it, even though only a few days old. And money in our culture is something you would never associate with the sacred. And yet for them, what that is, it's an honor to the ancestors. When you go see a chief, you can give him cola nuts, which centuries ago were actually forms of money, or you can give a chief a certain amount of money. You're not paying him. You're showing your respect for his position. And by giving the child, who may in fact be a reincarnated ancestor, you're actually showing respect to the ancestors directly. Once the family's accepted the child and gone through this pulnado, they take the child then to the chief. And the chief now is recognizing a new human in the community. And he does the same thing. The chief will give a little bit of currency, put it in the child's hand. And the chief then, through the child and through the ceremony, he's addressing the ancestors and basically saying, thank you very much for giving our community this wonderful new person. The reason I bring that up is because the first time I went to a Gullah community, you probably know Emery Campbell from St. Helena Island, Penn Center, South Carolina. Emery's well known in those areas. Anyway, he picked me up. I flew from West Africa. He picked me up at the airport in Savannah, drove me back to his home on St. Helena. It was a late flight, so I woke up a little bit late. And when I woke up, his wife, Emma, took me to the breakfast table and said, here's some cornflakes. I don't know if you like cornflakes, but anyway, some kind of breakfast. And I'm sitting there happily eating my cornflakes when a young woman about 20 came in from the community, St. Helena Island, to see Emery Campbell, who many people actually call him Chief. And I'm sitting there, oh, wow, the first time I, am in the Gullah Geechee culture. And she showed Emery the baby, the brand new baby. And then he took his wallet out. I thought, I'm not seeing what I'm about to see. This can't be happening. He took his wallet out. He took out a dollar bill. He folded it and put it into the baby's hands. And I looked absolutely shocked. And I said, oh, my God. I said, I can't believe this. And why? What's wrong? I said, this is precisely what is done in West Africa.
A lot of those, we have kept and maintained a lot of those cultural Passovers, those crossovers. We don't, from what we do not take a child out of the house, but that it doesn't have to do with superstition more so. It's for us, we just don't take that child out of the house because it's, just out of the womb. And the mother, she doesn't leave the house either. But there's something that I know that we do is anytime we're picking up a child and we're taking the child into another room, we call the child by name so that the child's spirit will follow, so that the child will not become restless. So an example would be my cousin Erica. When my cousin Erica was first born, I want to say they could not figure out what to name her. So they literally called her baby for the first couple days of her life. So anytime that they picked her up, come on, baby, and they'll literally take her wherever it was that she had that they were going to take her, so that her spirit wasn't restless. And it's interesting when you didn't do it, that's when she hollered the most.
Mm.
And it's so some of those things that we did or that we do are interesting to hear and even to see, even with the ring shout, because a lot of us Gullah Geechee people, we are an interesting hybrid. I like to say, of not only African traditions, but Native American and European. And a lot of the Gullah Geechee people, many of us, our ancestors did not come directly from Africa to the United States. Many of us stopped in the Caribbean before even getting here. So for my family, we have Haitian, Jamaican, and Bahamian ancestry. And so a lot of the things that I've heard and seen within the Caribbean, I have been able to make connections with to Gullah Geechee culture. Even as far as even connecting the ring shout with other traditions in the Caribbean, like Congo. A lot of Caribbean nations have a distinct dance style that they refer to as Congo, and it looks very similar to the ring shout. There's a slight difference in the fact that Congo looks more like a social dance, as opposed to the ring shout being more of a religious dance and religious connotation. Congo, it's like a cat and mouse game between a man and a woman. And you have the ring shout being this religious moment of praising God and communing with the ancestors. Because even while we're doing this shout, there are moments where I feel the presence of the ancestors. I feel the presence of my great grandmother. I feel, the presence of her mother during our performances. Um, and the previous shouters, the first generation of shouters who came, who basically started the group, I feel their presence when we perform. There's cases where those traditions, um, and even the level of superstition that we have and the traditions that we have and everything, they there's such a connection and there's such a strong connection that ties the Gullah Geechee to the Caribbean and the Caribbean to Africa and ties Africa with the Gullah Geechee. There's this unique thing that the Gullah Geechee Nation that we have, and that makes me so proud to be,
Very much.
Gullah Geechee.
Historians have noted quite a long time now, at least probably 75 years, strong cultural language similarities, especially with the Bahamas.
Yeah.
Bahamian language and storytelling are so similar to Gullah language and storytelling that I think as far back as the 1920s, there were folklorists saying that Bahamian culture is almost just a kind of offshoot of Gullah, or maybe fraternal traditions very close together. So that connection is obviously there. But there's another really, I think, a very important thing that connects the Caribbean, which is that both areas, both the Gullah Geechee region and the Caribbean, tropical climate and tropical diseases had an enormous impact on culture. It was South Carolina is an older colony, but by around 1715, South Carolina had a Black majority, though slavery was the norm. And though Africans were oppressed as elsewhere, they outnumbered the white people, and that carried into the 20th century, some parts of the Low Country, and to the extent that the dangers were so great for white people, because unlike Africans who had lived for generations with malaria and yellow fever and had developed some resistance to both of those diseases. Europeans had no exposure at all. And so white people ultimately, even though they were in the minority, they would, most of them in the Low Country area, would leave. Initially, they went up to Rhode Island. After the in later years, they realized if you could get out on the sea islands on the ocean side, the mosquitoes could hardly live there. Or if you could get what they now call upstate, in those days they'd say up country, into settlements that they built out just outside the Low Country, we start to see the pine trees instead of the palmetto palms, and you stop seeing the alligators and you stop seeing the mosquitoes. You just get away from those mosquitoes, and created an environment in which Black kids, I mean, on rice plantations during slavery days, Black people might go for 6 months a year without seeing a white person. It would be suicidal in those days for a white person to remain there during the spring and summer. And that experience, of course, is common throughout the Caribbean basin as well, where they were planting sugar mostly, but also where malaria and yellow fever were endemic, and Europeans just had to leave during that period of time. And it gave them a certain latitude. They had their gardens, their own gardens. They would hunt and raise pigs and raise chickens and all kinds of things. But beyond that, they also were not observed for long periods, and would carry on their traditions like Seekin and like the ring shout and like the praise house and all of that. It's funny because where I lived in West Africa, Sierra Leone has a similar blessing. There was so much malaria and yellow fever that in the 1800s, Europeans referred to Sierra Leone as the white man's grave. Even during colonial days, the British had to rely on Africans to run the colony, basically. There were a few white people who lived there, but they actually had a special place where they took them by a railroad from the city where they worked in the day up in the mountains where the water's flowing down, right? So you can't pool, and therefore the mosquitoes can't live there. And it had the same advantages. Sierra Leone also has preserved a lot of its traditional culture that you won't see in some other parts of Africa. And this will interest you. We had a president in Sierra Leone named Shaka Stevens, and he came up with an idea for their version of like the Medal of Honor, and here we have the Medal of Honor, the highest award for bravery. In Sierra Leone, they call it the Order of the Mosquito. Nothing has ever done so much good for Sierra Leone as that mosquito did. We didn't get stolen from us like in Kenya and Zimbabwe and South Africa. The mosquitoes made that impossible. So that's an interesting similarity.
Yes. When it comes to the Gullah Geechee's ability to have kept and maintain our traditions, it was because there were no white people. A lot of the coastal regions of South Carolina, Georgia, a lot of these areas, a lot of the Sea Islands were all Black owned. And it's sad to say that and see the state of these areas now. Because these areas were once all Black owned. And it's really, in knowing that, it's interesting because when people hear about the South and hear about racism and things like that, they like to paint the South as with this broad stroked brush. But I actually had the chance and the opportunity to talk with my great grandmother's baby sister before she passed. She died at 100 years old, my Aunt Gertie. And so one of the questions that I asked her was, because she was born in 1915. So I asked her, I was like, so have you ever experienced racism in your life? And she stopped. Racism? No. And I was like, wait, huh? And I literally was shocked. She was like, racism? No, we didn't experience. I never experienced racism, and I was like, how was that possible? And she said, well, baby, we've been the only family, yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, and for those who did not quite understand that, she said, baby, we were the only family here. And so she said most of the white people, they lived in Derry.
Mm.
And so where my family is, there was no other family aside from my family. A lot of the communities in among the Gullah Geechees nations, most of them are founded by a particular family. So the Briar Patch community, that's founded by the offspring of Amy and London Jenkins. Um, so my great grandmother's generations, I asked, her sister, and she was like, no, I never dealt with racism because white people were in Derry. We were self-sufficient where we were. The only time that if we did go to Darien, it was very rare. We had our own schools, we had our own farms, we had everything that we needed, so we didn't have to interact with white people. And so, with that understanding, and then knowing that after the emancipation, like you said, due to the mosquitoes and the bugs and things like that, after the emancipation, white folks hightailed it out because there was no longer a reason for them to stay. And without that reason, without the possibility for them to make money, there was no need for them to stay. So what they did was they actually sold a lot of their land to their former slaves. And so from what I understand, what I understand, you were able to get an acre of land. We would think for next to nothing. I think it was like an acre of land might have been $1, if I'm not mistaken. I could be
A
wrong.
lot of that
Don't quote
land
me on
was just a
that.
as well.
Yeah, I think an acre of land was like $1, if I'm not mistaken. Now we thinking about it now, yeah. But so what they did was, the majority of those former slaves, they gathered their resources and bought their own land or bought the land from their former master.
Mhm.
And that's how a lot of Gullah Geechee communities were able to establish themselves and establish their communities and be able to preserve and to keep alive these old traditions.
You know what's amazing
However,
about that is that they were isolated from white people.
yes, we
Brings.
were very
Let me
isolated.
just finish.
However, on the flip side of that isolation, it still did not stop the influence from. It did not stop the influence from of whites in religious context. So a lot of Gullah Geechee nations, or a lot of Gullah Geechee communities, I should say, a lot of Gullah Geechee communities, even though they kept these traditions alive and they kept a lot of these things alive, a lot of them trying to um, become more quote unquote civilized and become more and more like their white counterparts religiously, they began to allow some of the um, they began to allow these traditions to to die out. So a lot of communities, especially in South Carolina, they no longer did the dance form of the shout, but they kept the songs alive. So you would hear, for them, you would hear songs like Ezekiel in the Valley or Mary Rolled the Stone Away. For us here in my community in Georgia, my Uncle Nathan, who died at 103, there were very rare, there were rare cases in which my Uncle Nathan would actually sing a shout song during church service. No one would get up and shout, but he would sing a shout song during church service and we would clap and all of that. So it was, you did have those areas in which the ring shout, the song, the dance form might have passed away, but the song have always stayed alive within these Gullah Geechee communities.
You know, I became aware a few years ago that some church communities in the Charleston suburbs, some Gullah church communities in the Charleston suburbs were starting to allow shouts in modified form into their church service, and also even to encourage from the pulpit the old Sikh ritual with the teacher saying, this is not inconsistent with Christianity. In every culture, a boy becomes a man and a girl a woman at some point. So you can see that now being preserved new in urban areas. And there's always been, since at least the 20s, a fairly large community of Gullah people in Harlem. There are neighborhoods there. And I'm told they have their own doctors, their own churches, their own dentists and the like. And one South Carolina guy told me, I didn't have any trouble finding that area. I could tell because I went there at lunchtime and I could smell the food. Mr. Indians over here and others over here, but he couldn't miss the cooking in the Gullah area. But one lady who spent, and I've seen this from I lived on St. Helena Island, South Carolina for 2 years. And I saw that it was common. It had been common for generations. Send your kids from New York to family on the island in the summers. Let them imbibe that culture and then go back. And people come back and forth. And very typically when they die, if they die in New York, their bodies are brought back to be buried in family cemetery. So they keep that thing going. But one woman who lived in New York most of her adult life, she actually put her daughter in New York through a kind of Sikhin ritual, or as best as she could make it. She said that she hated to do it because the girl was very good at school, but she locked her in a room for 2 weeks and had her reading the Bible. She would check out, put her head through the door. Are you still reading that Bible? And she said she even put and this is common in some areas where they're Sikhin, the girls covered their faces are covered with wood ash. And she said she did that as well. I said, did your daughter resist it? She said, hell yes, she resisted it. But I said, I would expect her to. I think that's our culture.
I could definitely say I didn't do the wood ash thing, thank God. I didn't have to deal with the wood ash, but I do remember having to read the Bible, having to read 23rd Psalms. Reading the Bible, having to read 23rd Psalms, having to, be sure that I'm able to recite 23rd Psalms. I can't tell you how many times my grandmother made me read 23rd Psalms during that time period. Oh dear God. I want to say I was 9. I was 9 when I was baptized, and so I had to learn 23rd Psalms and all of that.
Have you seen the Gullah Bible? Have you taken a look?
No, I
the
haven't.
translation.
I've seen it, but I haven't. I've looked at it. And there's something that I also like to say. A lot of people think Gullah is a monolith, and it's going to sound the same everywhere. It's not. It's really not. Gullah is
not, but the
Gullah,
customs also. Customs are not.
Because of the fact that, like I stated before, you have Gullah Geechee people originating from so many different areas. So each community would sound completely different. And I found out through my own research and learning and things like that, that it's the same exact way in Africa as well. You can tell where a person is from. They can speak the same language, but the dialect or the way that they would speak would be completely different. So Gullah is pretty much the same exact way. In South Carolina, in Charleston, you have this heavy Bahamian, Bayesian kind of sound.
It sounds more Caribbean.
And in our community, we have a Bahamian, we have more of a Bahamian, Jamaican, almost slightly Trinidadian kind of thing going. And the only reason I was able to make the comparison was I had this opportunity to spend time in Houston, Texas, and I was a part of this group of people, and they were from all over the Caribbean. So we had a woman from St. Croix, people from Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, the U.S. Virgin Islands. And with me, I have this habit of if I'm around people of Caribbean descent, I'll speak in Gullah on purpose so that I can pull the accent. Because no matter if a person is from the island or of Gullah descent, if you hear someone speaking speaking that way, it
But
pulls
please,
that accent.
don't leave Africa out of this, because
Right.
the west coast of Africa has all these
Exactly.
said
Very
earlier.
true.
You said
Very
earlier, I forget the sentence, but it was almost the same in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, very
But,
true.
I
And
thought I'd
so
share.
I had that chance to speak, and literally you had 5 different dialects of English going on all in one
I
conversation.
would say Creole dialects.
Yeah, you had 5 different
Yeah.
5 different Creole dialects of
So
English going
let
on
me
in one
ask you,
conversation.
in your version of Gullah Geechee, would this make sense to you if I said Yen Dede?
Mhm.
He's not there.
He's not there.
And in Sierra Leone, where I lived, it's Inodede. Almost exactly the same.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I thought you'd enjoy this. I was at Penn Center, St. Helena Island, years ago when they launched the Gullah Bible. And they brought in a man in his 80s and asked him what he thought of it. And this is what he said. Everybody was laughing. It was the most perfect thing to say. He said, "This is the first time a Yeti God that talk seemed like a me that talk. It's the first time I've ever heard God speaking the same way I talk."
Wow.
This is
That's
such a
it's so,
fascinating conversation, and I'm really sorry to jump in there, but we're gonna run out of time, and I want to make sure that we get to answer the great questions that our attendees have been posting. So thanks for indulging me here and interrupting. Are you ready? We want to start out with Amanda and Miles were asking early on, can you please define shout? Because I think it's the movement and not the vocal part.
yes. The shout is actually the dance-like movement of its participants, as opposed to the singing or the song speaking part. Um, Shouting is, as I said before, the dance-like movement, which kind of, because of the religious undertones of shouting, it translated over into the shouting of catching the Holy Ghost that we see within the Pentecostal church to
But
this
please,
day.
they're not singing along with the rhythmic movement.
Yes, but when we're speaking of shout in the term of as far as the ring shout is concerned, the singing is just that, singing. The shouting is the dance-like movement, which has translated over into the shouting that you see within the Pentecostal church to this day.
Great, thank you. And then Dorothy asked if you have ever performed with African people and what that was like for you.
That was amazing. Oh my God. I actually, when I first started, I've done African dance for over 20 years. And I had my family, before I became part of the group, my grandmother in 2001, we had a choreographer, Ralph Lemon, come from New York because he wanted to do this piece on Gullah Geechee culture. So he brought with him 2 guys from Cote d'Ivoire, JJ Garives and Gullah Vincent. And while we were there, he taught African my grandmother actually asked me to go in her place because Ralph wanted to talk to her, but because it was during the Christmas holiday, my grandmother was like, "Brenton, I'm tired. I don't feel like talking to nobody. You go. Everything I know, you know, and you've also done a little bit more legwork." So I was like, Okay. At first I fought her. I didn't want to go, but I ended up going and learning African dance and everything. And there was that later on that same year, they JJ and Gullah, they came back and they brought with them two other guys from Cote d'Ivoire. And we were singing the final performance of the Shouters. They sung Farewell Last. And that's typically the last song that we sing of the night, but it was also the last song that they sung during a performance. And while we were singing Farewell Last, Gone Farewell, the guy, one of the guys, he was singing the lyric, he was singing Farewell Last, but he was singing it in his language. So we were singing Farewell Last while he was singing the vocal piece or the actual chord, like the lead part. I'm guessing he managed to hear enough of it to where he was actually able to catch the words to where he actually sung the song in his language while we responded in Gullah and with our own chorus. So that was an amazing period because at first we were hearing it and everybody was looking back like, what is he singing? And then it wasn't until we actually listened like really, really closely until he got loud enough. And we realized that he was singing our song, but he was singing it in his language. That was phenomenal.
Wow, that is great. Thank you for telling that story. We also have John who asked if there are any cultural differences in the Gullah people who live on the Sea Island and those who live in the Low Country.
There are absolutely no differences. In fact, they are the same people. They literally are the same people. The only difference would be the way or the speed in which we talk. The closer you are, I don't know why it's this way, but the closer you are to salt water, the faster you talk. The further away you are from salt water, the slower you talk. I don't know why it's that way, but it's something that happens. If you're right there on the coast, you speak extremely fast. People in my family, we're what you would call saltwater geese. So we speak very, very fast. Some members of our family speak faster than others. While you have freshwater Geechees who speak really slow. And for us who are saltwater Geechees, we're literally sitting there looking at them like, what's taking you so long? Like they'll drag certain words, whereas saltwater Geechees, we just go ahead, we chop words off, take a letter here, or put a letter there, or something like that. While freshwater Geechees, they kind of drag their words.
Yeah, if I could come in just for a second. The geography, what we're really talking about here is the geography of the Low Country. You have the Sea Island, but then you also have the dry land or freshwater areas up to 30 miles inland.
Yep.
And that's stretching down from just the very bottom of North Carolina, the Cape Fear area, all along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, and then into that northeastern bit of Florida. There is, I think, almost a kind of a myth that has urban myth that has been in a feature of journalism for many years, that the only true Gullahs are the people living on the islands, when in fact it's all the Gullah region. And rice, of course, and rice growing is one of the defining features of Gullah beaches. And that only took place on the mainland. There was no cultivation of rice commercially on the Sea Island. That was Sea Island cotton, which was also a very, very lucrative crop. But they're definitely all the same people. I think one thing, though, you could say is that the people on the islands are much more vulnerable because those areas have been taken up by resort development that has really just been a terrible in terms of people being able to preserve their homes, their property, their lifestyle, their culture. Once the resorts move in and the land values go up, people can no longer pay the taxes on their property. And unless something is done to help them, they're gone.
All right.
Mm. Wow. So before we go any further, because we're getting towards our end time, Brenton and Joseph, can I put you on the spot? Are you going to give us another 5 minutes so we can get to more of those questions, please?
Sure.
Oh, great. Thank you. So we have Amanda and Miles are asking if the ring shout is done on Easter Saturday too, like the Easter Rock in Louisiana. And
No.
she asks if they're associated special foods. She said, I think in Louisiana, it's 12 cakes to fuel the shouters through the night.
No, with the shout, it's only done during watch night service now. As I stated before, it used to be done during the week of Christmas. It used to be done for 2 weeks, which started on the week of Christmas and ended on New Year's Day. Now it's only done on watch night service. As far as special foods, typically because of it being that time of year, seafood and where we are, a staple in Gullah cuisine, like the gentleman said, rice is. There's a saying that no meal is a meal without a pot of rice. A Gullah meal ain't a meal without a pot of rice. So there's always rice being served, but seafood is also typically always served as well. But it's only done during New Year's Day now, or New Year's Eve.
Great. Thank you. And one other question was, if other than keeping the rhythm, does the role of the stickman have additional cultural or spiritual significance?
The role of the stickman is pretty much like that of drummers, because after the Haitian Revolution and the Nat Turner revolution that happened, the revolt that happened with Nat Turner, they completely outlawed drums in the United States, because there was at one point where drums were allowed. So the ring shout was actually performed with drums. But after the drums were outlawed, they then began to use a mortar and pestle. It's the drummer, the stickman's role is literally that of a drummer, to keep pace, to keep time, and to maintain the rhythm and to drive the energy of the shout. That's really what the stickman role is, just like the drummer. A drummer's task is to drive the energy of whatever ceremony is going on so that the energy is high enough in order to call spirit forward. The same exact thing with the stickman. The stickman's sole purpose is to keep and maintain the rhythm, driving the energy of the shout based on how the song is set, which is how the song is started, and going forward and keeping and maintaining that so that the energy and the message of that song or the emotions of that song can be conveyed.
Let me finish off that thought by saying that 30 years ago, I had the opportunity of hearing Mr. McIver, who was for many years the stickman for the McIntosh County Shouters. He was in his 80s then, or older. And I went with my colleague, Cynthia Schmidt, who's an ethnomusicologist. She's spent 50 years studying music in various parts of Africa and the Caribbean and the Gullah area. But she had not heard the shouters and didn't know that much about them. But the moment Mr. McIver began with his stick on the plywood, Cynthia just lost it. And she whispered into my ear, she said, I have heard that rhythm in Africa many times. I have never heard it anywhere else in the world. And of course, she was speaking of America and even the Caribbean. So it speaks to what a unique and important custom the ring shout is, yeah. And what a national treasure it is. It should be, at least here in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then I have one more question before we then close it with Pamela. The last question that we want to ask is, does the Sierra Leonean influence go both ways? Are a lot of Sierra Leoneans descendants of formerly enslaved people who returned to Africa from the US.
And that's one of the great things about that connection, is that we can see very clearly in the records of the slave ships that a great many people were taken from what is now Sierra Leone to the ports of Charleston and Savannah. And at different periods, it was more or less. Coastal Georgia seems to have received much more, a higher percentage of people from what's now Sierra Leone than South Carolina, though it's still significant there. But what we also know is that during the American Revolutionary War, the British offered freedom to enslaved people from South Carolina, Georgia, and other colonies if they would join the British Army. And what happened eventually is that the Black folks from South Carolina and Georgia made up a high percentage, at least a third of those who joined with the Brits. And when the British lost the war, they took these soldiers up to Canada, to Nova Scotia. And then a few years later, they transported them back to Sierra Leone. So the thing that makes Sierra Leone so significant for Gullah Geechee people is that two-way connection. People were taken away, but people were also offered the opportunity of going back to that very same spot. There is a recorded story, by the way, of one of those people who came from Canada in 1792. And one of them, within a day or two, he actually ran into his own mother, who had not seen him for 20 years, and assumed he was dead probably. And she collapsed. And similar things happened to other people who came back. They found their families in Sierra Leone. So it's a special connection.
Thank you so much. And I am so grateful for both of you to being here with us. And I would love to close this session with one of the comments that comes from Pamela Gladstone, who says, "This is an excellent presentation. My mother used to be a McIntosh Shouter. The ancestors are smiling at you, Brenton. I am so proud of you, and I am moved to tears."
Thank you, cousin.
This is what it's all about. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who joined us. We are really grateful for your generosity in sharing, and for everybody to come and share their questions and be present here with us. And we hope to see you again at another WMI Plus, and we hope to see you, Brenton, in New York City when we hopefully get to present you live. Thanks again.
I hope to be there too.
Yeah, please have a great rest of the evening, or our Australian friends a great rest of the day. And thanks for being a member of the World Music Institute community. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.